The hearing will come to order, and good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. It's a great pleasure to convene the subcommittee to discuss U.S. Taiwan relations, a partnership that enjoys broad bipartisan support. As the State Department has said, Taiwan is a force for good in the world, a beacon of democracy. Indeed, Taiwan is a critical security partner and an exemplar of democracy and human rights in a region short on both. It is the United States' 10th largest trading partner, and I might add, it is our 6th largest agricultural export market. And it's so vital to the trade that we have in this country. Taiwan's success is a potent rebuttal to authoritarian revisionist powers that are attempting to undermine the primacy of democracy and upend the global order that has given us peace and prosperity since the days of World War II. Taiwan's example is all the more important as China recommits to one totalitarianism under Xi Jinping. In recent months, Xi has justified taking lifelong power by arguing that he's the only figure who can accomplish China's so-called rejuvenation. Reunifying Taiwan, peacefully or otherwise, would be a key part of this accomplishment, and it seems likely Xi will force this issue within his lifetime. In the South China Sea last week, he conducted the largest show of maritime force in China's history, and this week he will double down on his intimidation with live-fire exercises in the Taiwan Strait. Xi Jinping wants Taiwan to be subjugated under his rule and is making concerted efforts to accomplish this result. As he pressures the U.S. Taiwan partnership, we will have to reinforce our ties. Congress has always led on Taiwan affairs, and it will be incumbent on Congress to continue our leadership. Chairman Chabot's Taiwan Travel Act, who incidentally used to chair this committee, became law last month and is a shining example of how Congress can do this. This bill helps break down self-imposed restrictions on contact with Taiwan that are not required by our policy and have hindered our bilateral relations. The House has also passed my own legislation, H.R. 3320, to promote Taiwan's participation at the WHA or the World Health Assembly. Taiwan's exclusion from the summit, despite being a model contributor to World Health, shows that Beijing is willing to put the world at risk to satisfy its own pettiness and insecurities. I hope the Senate will act on this legislation quickly, as the World Health Assembly will meet again next month. Taiwan has made major contributions in the field of global health, including making significant breakthroughs during the SARS epidemic and providing critical support during the 2014 Ebola crisis. In this Congress, I've also introduced measures to support a U.S. Taiwan free trade agreement and support the normalization of arms sales to Taiwan, but there's still much more work to do. Congressman Chabot's Travel Act touches on a creeping problem within U.S. Taiwan policies. In many areas beyond travel and diplomatic contact, the United States observes self-imposed restrictions on our conduct, self-censor, or allows the ambiguities of U.S. Taiwan policies to constrain our relationships instead of expanding it. This rot has set in over decades since the foundations of the One China policy when they were laid down. I'm concerned that over the years, the executive branch has institutionalized a norm of avoiding displeasing Beijing, and that our diplomats make decisions about Taiwan that are based on fear instead of the merits of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship itself. It is seen clearly when the State Department delays arms sales to avoid angering Beijing or removes the Taiwan's flag from its website after the PRC diplomats complain. I believe that Congress can help to stop this rot and reinforce the United States' relationship with Taiwan, and I'm grateful that we have such an expert panel with us today to make recommendations on how to accomplish this. Ultimately, the U.S. policy on Taiwan is transitory. Taiwan's status has been left undefined and must come to a resolution eventually. In the Shanghai Communique, the United States simply acknowledged that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. I doubt that such agreement exists today. Xi Jinping has his answer. He wants Taiwan to be a province of the PRC and is working to make that happen. The United States must find its own answer, and I look forward to searching for it today and get clarification. And with that, Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record, and without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, question, and extraneous material subject to the rule length, and the witnesses' written statements will be entered into the hearing record. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I turn to the ranking member for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding these hearings. During my now almost 22 years in Congress, I've been a strong supporter of the Taiwan-U.S. relationship. I've introduced legislation to supply naval frigates to Taiwan to support Taiwan's entry into the International Police Organization, and I joined with Congressman Chabot and our chairman, Mr. Royce, and others in introducing the Taiwan Travel Act that is now law. Taiwan has 23 million people, $80 billion of trade with the United States. The Taiwan Travel Act would encourage diplomatic exchanges at the highest levels. Consistent with this act, we should no longer hesitate to send our Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State or National Security Advisor to Taiwan for better communications in our bilateral relationship. And Congress should welcome Taiwan's president or foreign minister in delivering an address, particularly at the presidential level, to a joint session of Congress. Should point out that that comment relates to the president of Taiwan, not the president for life of Taiwan. Taiwan does not have a president for life. That is the situation in another nearby country. I should also point out that I'm probably the only member of Congress that benefits from the current craziness that the president of Taiwan visits the United States on a refueling stop on the way to a state visit to Central America. The reason for that is that traditionally the president of Taiwan stops for refueling in Los Angeles and comes to the Sheraton Universal Hotel in my district, thereby allowing me to welcome the president of Taiwan to my district on more occasions than would be likely the case under any other circumstances. That being said, the Taiwan Travel Act is perhaps the only piece of legislation disadvantageous to the 30th Congressional District that I'm proud to say is law. I'm very concerned that China has tried to keep Taiwan out of international organizations. We should be helping Taiwan gain membership to the World Health Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the UN Climate Change Convention, and Interpol. Taiwan's vital contributions to the work of these organizations would make the world a healthier and safer place. In support of such efforts, I joined as a original co-sponsor to the chairman's bill seeking to give Taiwan observer status to the World Health Assembly. Criminals and diseases benefit by excluding Taiwan from organizations designed to combat crime and disease. And it is hard to think that Beijing would work tirelessly to try to support disease and crime. Yet that is what they're doing by preventing Taiwan from being an efficient member of these international organizations. I support the Global Cooperation and Training Initiative, through which Taiwanese expertise helps developing countries in areas such as health, the digital divide, gender development, and humanitarian assistance. As to defense and economics, in accordance with the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances, we should maintain our arms sales that support Taiwan's legitimate defense needs. Such sales also do create jobs here in the United States and help maintain our defense industry. And we need to seek an increase in Taiwanese investment in the United States and U.S. exports to Taiwan of goods and services. Currently, we export $26 billion in goods and $12 billion in services. What is at stake here is our dedication to democracy. Taiwan tied several other Asian countries for the highest democracy score in an international rating from Freedom House. And I would say that Taiwan does pose a threat to China. That threat is one of example. When the people of mainland China see that a country sharing the same language can benefit from democracy, can benefit from the rule of law and a truly free and vibrant economy, then that is a threat not only to China but to all of the oppressive regimes around the world. So I look forward to deepening our relationship with Taiwan and dismissing the silliness that prevents Taiwan from participating with the United States and with the rest of the world. I yield back.
Appreciate your comments. Next, we'll go to Mr. Dana Rohrbacher from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just note that countries, major countries, small countries, only have one legitimate government. There's only one, and there is only one legitimate government in terms of the Chinese people, and it's the government in Taiwan. The fact is, government by the American standards, the government by American standards is only a legitimate government if it operates with the consent of the governed. Mainland China is run by a clique of gangsters who make no pretense about democratic rule and permitting opposition parties or stamping out anybody who provides any type of disagreement with the policy being advocated and performed by the clique that runs that country. So yes, if we're looking at what countries have a legitimate government, Taiwan is a legitimate government, and it's occupied, yes, by many Chinese people, but let us note that there are Taiwanese people there, and now you have Chinese and Taiwanese people on that island of Taiwan operating in democratic government. So if the United States has to side with anybody, if there is a conflict between the gangsters and the clique that are pretending to be a government and the real government that exists on Taiwan, let us note that didn't always happen. President Lee was a great reformer in Taiwan, and he brought what was just an anti-communist group in Taiwan that were allied with us in the Cold War. He brought the reforms that have made the government of Taiwan legitimate in our eyes. Now, as we move in with President Trump's fair trade, that's an issue we have to work with the Taiwanese on, and I hope that we will be doing that with the spirit of goodwill. And while we're doing that, let's recognize that the Chinese clique in Beijing is engaged in policies and actual practices that threaten the peace of the world, especially in terms of their expansionist policies in building those islands that threaten commerce in the Pacific region. So with that said, thank you for the hearing, Mr. Chairman. I'll be looking forward to hearing from the witnesses.
No, and I really appreciate your comments. And before we go to the next statement, I want to remind people that we're up against a competing committee hearing on Syria, and I know members will be leaving. I want to let you guys know I'm going to continue. I'm not going to that. I'm staying here, and feel free to come back or feel free to stay. Next, we'll go to Mr. Jerry Conley from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also thank you for this hearing. I'm proud to serve as one of the co-chairs of the Taiwan Caucus. I have gone to Taiwan almost 24 times in my lifetime, starting as an Eisenhower Fellow back in 1988. Three points I would make. One, no one should mistake congressional interest in protecting and fostering relations with Taiwan. It stems from the Taiwan Relations Act, which was a congressional foreign policy initiative. That came from the legislative branch in response to an executive branch action with respect to normalization with the mainland. So from day one, Congress had a particularized interest in Taiwan. Secondly, the Chinese government in the mainland has often talked about one China, two systems when it came to Hong Kong. We now see how hollow some of those promises prove out to be. And so if Beijing thinks it's sending a signal of confidence, you can trust on us, see it works, the opposite is happening. And it's having an effect not only in Taiwan with a democratic elected government, but also here in the United States. So erosion of confidence in assurances with respect to two systems will respect the democratic one. And finally, there's the whole issue of the United States' relations with China. We don't want to go to war with China. We don't want to have a hostile relationship with China. We want to have a good workman-like relationship. We're competitors, but it ought to be within the very normal bounds. Having said that, Taiwan could change that. And it's very important Beijing not miscalculate United States interests and intents. Because that's how trouble starts. That's how conflict happens. The United States, certainly through the expression of its legislative branch, is not going to be intimidated or threatened or manipulated into a relationship or non-relationship with Taiwan that's not in our interest. We're going to foster that relationship. We're going to grow it. We're going to protect it. And I do often fear, Mr. Chairman, that other powers in the region could maybe misunderstand that and, as a result, miscalculate. And I think both on the Republican and Democratic side, we wish to reaffirm our strong support for both the relationship with Beijing, but also our special relationship with Taiwan as codified in the Taiwan Relations Act. I yield back.
Thank you for your comments. Next, we'll go to Ms. Ann Wagner from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing. Taiwan, once an authoritarian country, is now one of Asia's freest and most democratic. Yet Chinese leadership on the mainland is keen to demonstrate its power over Taiwan. We have seen this time and time again. Tomorrow, the People's Liberation Army will conduct the first live-fire drills in the Taiwan Strait since 2015. Without active resistance and response from Taiwan, the U.S. And allies of democracy across the world, China will continue to aggressively undermine Taiwan's sovereignty. China's behavior towards Taiwan threatens regional stability and global democratic values, and I appreciate this committee's attention to the challenges that Taiwan faces. Mr. Chairman, I have a number of excellent questions that I hope to be able to return to ask after the Syria discussion. If not, I shall submit them to the record. So I thank you very, very much for being here and for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your comments. Next, we'll go to Mr. Scott Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I don't often make or usually make these opening statements because I like to hear from you folks, but some of the things that were said, I feel like they deserve a response and a clarification. Nobody on this dais and nobody in this country that I know of wants to be in a war with China. But if it means that we must then kowtow and continue to kowtow to China, to support a free and democratic Taiwan, then we're going to have to change course somewhere. We can't just simply do what China says for fear of some kind of aggressive action. They are aggressive. They are a strategic adversary. They are not allies. We can do business with them. But let's be really clear here, folks. China and the government in China, they are not the friends of the United States of America, and in many respects, in this man's opinion, they are not the friends of Taiwan. We should be supporting those who are most like us, those who are more supportive of us, and that is Taiwan. It is not China.
Thank you for your comments. Next, we'll go to our panelists. We're thankful to be joined today by Mr. Mark Stokes, who is Executive Director at the Project 2049 Institute and 20-year United States Air Force veteran. We thank you for your service. Next, Mr. Julian Ku, who is the Senior Associate Dean for the Academic Affairs, Faculty Director of International Programs, and the Maurice A. Dean Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law at the Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University, and Ms. Tiffany Ma, who is the Senior Director at Bauer Group Asia and a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asia Research. I think you all have been here before. You know how it works. There's a button here that says talk. Oh, I just hit mine. That was a demonstration. And the light will turn green, then it'll go down to when you have a minute yellow, and then red. And we try to ask you to stay within 5 minutes so that we can get on, okay, with the questions. Thank you. Mr. Stokes, if you'd start, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Esteemed members of the subcommittee, it's an honor and pleasure to be here to testify for you today alongside my distinguished colleagues. I'll keep my remarks brief. I'd like to start off with a statement, and that statement is Taiwan, under its current Republic of China Constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state. This is objective reality. It's controversial, this language, but this is objective reality, and complicated for more than one reason. Simply use of that term, Republic of China, ROC in short, is controversial, not just here in Washington, but certainly in Beijing, and certainly in some parts of significant parts of Taiwan. My remarks I will outline. One last point on this: the real dilemma, this objective reality is different from our policy. It's a separate issue than recognition. Objective reality and the existence of a state is separate from the recognition issue. And it's a complex policy challenge for the United States to somehow bring our policy in line with this objective reality in a way that is incremental and preferably does not get anybody killed in the process. In my written testimony, I outline 4 schools of thought that have informed U.S. cross-strait policy over the decades and presumably could inform U.S. policy going forward. I also outline 3 rationales for why a fundamental examination of U.S. policy is warranted. And then finally outline 5 sets of recommendations. In terms of 4 schools of thought, the first school of thought is accommodation. This has become more prominent over the last decade or so. But accommodation effectively calls for bringing U.S. policy in line with Beijing's One China principle. Basically, that there is one China. There is one China, Taiwan is part of China, and the PRC, People's Republic of China, is the sole representative of China in the international community. And there are different forms of accommodation. In its purest form, there are calls, or have been in the calls, particularly in the 2009 timeframe, to at least amend the Taiwan Relations Act, specifically the security-related portions of that, and there appeared to be a concerted effort to do that. The second school of thought is status quo. The status quo has guided U.S. policy, has been by far the dominant school of thought since the Taiwan Relations Act. It emphasizes the value of the Taiwan Relations Act. It has maintained peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region and has been quite useful in sort of serving as a legal basis for U.S. policy. Beijing is not happy with this status quo. The third school of thought is normalization. The normalization school of thought has been around a long time, and that is to be able to separate ourselves from our One China policy and move toward full normalization of our relations with Taiwan. It's straightforward. And the fourth school of thought is probably the least well-developed, but has a long history, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, in the early 70s in the context of dual representation within the United Nations. And that concept roughly is there is, in a non-defined U.S. One China policy, there is nothing that would contradict having normal relations with both sides as governments. And that has been, in the past, that has been, bear in mind that we had normal relations, relatively normal relations with both sides of the Taiwan Strait between 1972 and 1979. So those are 4 schools of thoughts. In terms of sort of some broad outlines of recommendations or sets of recommendations, I outlined 5. The first is that there needs to be a very fundamental policy review and an interagency working group set up to ask the very, very tough questions. That question should be not if, but how the United States can align its policy with objective reality. To me, that is a critical question. How to achieve a stable, normal, and constructive relationship. in whatever substantive changes are developed, recommend that they be incremental, coordinated with senior government officials on Taiwan, and scrupulously avoid getting entangled with domestic politics on Taiwan. The second set of recommendations had to do with the legal foundations of the Taiwan Travel Act and the Taiwan Relations Act, and that's that senior level officials should be encouraged to regularly and meet with counterparts from the Republic of China government or Taiwan government on an institutionalized basis. And there are all kinds of ways one can finesse this issue. Other structural issues, like, for example, considering taking the Office of Taiwan Coordination within the State Department and perhaps considering moving that to a different part, maybe as a direct reporting agency under the Secretary of State. And then there are others, people-to-people exchanges, formalized, using the one we have with Beijing, and using that as an example at a very senior level to be able to institutionalize a full range of ongoing educational and cultural exchanges that we have. Things like supply chain security, I think, are worthwhile considering. And then in terms on the defense side, there's a whole range of things, but one of them could be, I think, what is worthy of considering is a public statement that that reasserts the Taiwan Strait as international waters. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And before we go to you, Mr. Ku, we've been had the distinct honor of being joined by the committee chairman of the full committee, Mr. Ed Royce, who's done so much for foreign policy for this country, for around the world, and especially the Asia-Pacific region. So we've been joined, and he has an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman, and I appreciate, again, your engagement. I appreciate all these members' engagement in Asia and this important hearing on Taiwan here. Over the last several months, we've seen a number of positive developments in Taiwan in terms of the relationship. The Taiwan Travel Act, for which I was the original co-sponsor, was signed into law by the President. As we all know, that was deeply appreciated by the Taiwanese people. It was a message that I heard a number of times when I was in Taipei over the Easter recess for meetings with President Tsai and other members of her cabinet. I believe that by encouraging more frequent visits between our two governments, including at the highest levels, we will further strengthen the rather critical relationship that we have. And that's why I make a point as chairman to visit Taiwan each year. I've also been a champion for strengthening Taiwan's economic and people-to-people links from the grassroots level on up to the high-level policy making in Washington. And last month I took the inaugural China Airlines daily nonstop flight from Ontario, California to Taoyuan Airport in Taiwan. This was built upon the years of work in supporting linkages between U.S. and Taiwan through the Visa Waiver and Global Entry Program in 2012 and in 2017. These programs have translated into new growth with travel volume between the U.S. and Taiwan, increasing with these business visits and people visiting families by about 50%. Most pressing, I think, today in terms of what can be done is inclusion at the World Health Assembly meeting next month. Over the years, Taiwan has contributed to international efforts to improve global health with financial and technical assistance. Any of us who've ever been to any one of these disaster sites know that Taiwanese physicians are usually first there. We've seen the assistance that comes in and the capability, the knowledge. However, it was excluded from the meeting last year after 8 consecutive years of being able to observe the meetings. Keeping Taiwan out can only hurt global health, and there should be no question about Taiwan's participation this year. And over the weekend, the last point I would make is that the New York Times ran an article that named Taiwan as the new bastion of free speech in Asia. I've seen this with my own eyes, the U.S. and Taiwan's shared commitment to principles such as human rights, freedom of speech, democratic norms, certainly rule of law. All of that serves as a bedrock of this partnership that we have. So I'm glad we're here today to discuss how we can reinforce that important relationship. And I thank again Chairman Yoho and the other members of this committee and I look forward to the witness's testimony.
Thank you for those comments, and thank you for attending. Mr. Ku, we'll go to you next for your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the members of the subcommittee for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. In the interest of time, I'll just focus on 2 of the 3 issues I addressed in my written testimony. I want to concentrate first on the legally binding effect of congressional declarations of policy in laws like the Taiwan Relations Act and the Taiwan Travel Act. And second, I want to address how Congress can use its powers to declare policy that can help clarify the U.S. One China policy. I'll leave the 3rd issue to my written testimony. So from a lawyer's point of view, the Taiwan Relations Act is a law that has guided U.S. policy toward Taiwan for nearly 40 years. And in addition to providing legal mechanisms allowing the U.S. and Taiwan to maintain unofficial relations, it also sets forth the goals of U.S. Taiwan policy with admirable clarity. And I want to emphasize to the subcommittee and the members of the committee here, Congress here, that the declarations of policy in the Taiwan Relations Act are not merely non-binding statements without any legal force. Unlike concurrent resolutions that are never presented to the president for his signature, the Taiwan Relations Act was passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president. As such, it is the supreme law of the land under Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. This is true of the Taiwan Relations Act, and as I've written recently, this is also true of the recently enacted Taiwan Travel Act. Congressional declarations of policy, even ones phrased in non-mandatory language such as should, are not mere window dressing. Rather, unless those statements of policy are deemed to impermissibly interfere with the president's constitutional authority over international affairs, such policy declarations must be taken seriously as legal obligations by the executive branch of the United States government. This is true even if the only enforcement mechanism for such obligations are congressional hearings, such as this one, and other forms of congressional oversight. Congress should not allow the Department of State to simply dismiss laws like the Taiwan Travel Act or the earlier Taiwan Relations Act as merely legally non-binding. Secondly, I'd like to address the overarching issue that Chairman Yoho addressed in his opening remarks and others have alluded to, the big question in U.S. Taiwan relations. Now, according to China, as members of this committee well know, according to China's point of view, the United States agreed in 1972 when it signed the Joint Communique to a one China principle that encompasses a recognition of Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. Now, this is China's point of view, but the U.S. did not specifically commit to recognizing Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan in that document. Instead, the U.S. position on Taiwan is better understood as one of neutrality. The United States takes no legal view on whether Taiwan is part of China. Rather, the U.S. goal, which is stated in the Taiwan Relations Act, is to ensure that any final resolution on the status of Taiwan is made through peaceful means, free of coercion of any kind. And as I've argued in prior writings, the statements of prior U.S. administrations that have opposed Taiwanese independence, when combined with the ambiguous language of the Joint Communique, could undermine the legal basis for a U.S. military defense of Taiwan in the future conflict. Congress can help to avoid such implications and clarify the U.S. position by statute. Such a congressional declaration can coordinate policy across the executive branch's bureaucracy, and it can guide U.S. policy across different presidential administrations of both parties. I think we've seen here today that there's both bipartisan interest and support for Taiwan in the United States Congress. A congressional declaration of policy on the U.S. position on the status of Taiwan should guide any revision to internal U.S. government approaches, such as the guidelines on Taiwan set forth by the State Department on U.S.-Taiwan relations. So in closing, as Congressman Connolly mentioned in his remarks, I believe the U.S. Congress has a central role to play in shaping and overseeing U.S. policy toward Taiwan. I earnestly hope that the members of this committee and their fellow members of the House and Senate will continue the proud tradition of Congress leading on developing U.S.-Taiwan policy and reinforcing the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. Ms. Tiffany Ma, next.
Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the committee, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss the importance of reinforcing the U.S. Taiwan relationship. To begin, the U.S. vision for the Indo-Pacific region underscores the importance of Taiwan to the United States. This administration has advocated a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which emphasizes freedom from external coercion as well as openness in terms of trade, investment, infrastructure, and maritime movement. And this really does read like a strategy that is tailor-made for advancing U.S.-Taiwan relations. Moreover, we should consider that Taiwan's positive contributions to regional stability serve as a force multiplier towards U.S. strategic objectives. For example, Taiwan is a member of the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. It is actively complying with UN sanctions on North Korea, and it is deepening regional cooperation through its New Southbound policy, as well as with the United States through the Global Cooperation and Training Framework. It is important to note here that the U.S.-Taiwan relationship also intersects with other key U.S. priorities in terms of trade and security in the region. On trade, as the chairman mentioned, Taiwan is the United States' 10th largest trading partner by goods and the 6th largest market for U.S. food and agriculture products. Taiwan also sends one of the largest delegations to the Select USA Investment Summits, and Foxconn, a Taiwanese company, its new investment in a facility in Wisconsin could employ up to 13,000 people. On the security front, I want to emphasize that U.S.-Taiwan cooperation is critical to Taiwan's defense and deterrence against China's increasing military threat. Overall, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship is robust, and this is marked by several of the events that we've just discussed, including the passage of the Taiwan Travel Act, the recent very well-received visit of Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Alex Wong to Taipei, and of course the opening of a new American Institute in Taiwan complex later this year, which is going to be marked with the anticipation of high-level U.S. representation present. But despite these very positive measures, there are of course increasing challenges to the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Although President Tsai has committed to maintaining the status quo since taking office, it is increasingly clear that China is effectively rewriting, not just changing, the cross-strait status quo through coercion and sharp power tactics in an attempt to push the people of Taiwan towards unification, which is Beijing's ultimate goal. And these developments are indeed extremely concerning and cause for us to reinforce the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And to this end, I recommend the following measures. First, we need to maintain a consistent and coherent approach towards Taiwan, and here Congress's oversight role is indispensable. Congress can also play a role in helping to dispel notions about using Taiwan as a bargaining chip by reaffirming U.S. commitments to Taiwan. Second, we need to work towards integrating Taiwan into the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and one of the ways that we can do this is to harness the natural convergences between Taiwan's New Southbound policy and in terms of areas of infrastructure and innovation promotion. Third, we need to make serious efforts to address economic and trade issues in Taiwan. The immediate priority, in my view, should be ensuring that Taiwan receives an exemption from the steel and aluminum tariffs. Imposing tariffs on Taiwan sends the wrong message about U.S. treatment of such an important partner as Taiwan and serves as an impediment and a distraction from moving forward on other forms of economic cooperation. There's also, in my view, significant potential for building on U.S.-Taiwan cooperation in the field of intellectual property protection and trade secrets. Fourth, it is imperative that we deepen and broaden our security relationship with Taiwan. One way to start would be regularize arms sales and treating Taiwan like a normal security partner. The primary consideration ought to be what we deem to be in Taiwan's self-defense interests rather than what is the least objectionable to China, because they are certain to object irrespective. We can also expand defense cooperation with Taiwan, including on things that have already been discussed, such as potential Taiwan participation in RIMPAC, port cores, and building on existing areas of cooperation, in particular cybersecurity. And last, in support of the previous recommendation, we ought to commence meaningful and regular high-level exchanges that can move the needle on these critical trade and security issues. In conclusion, there is significant potential in strengthening U.S. Taiwan relations, and in doing so, we will only reinforce the long-term U.S. security goals in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the committee, and I look forward to your questions.
I appreciate everybody's testimony. Look forward to getting some good questions. As I said, we're under time constraints with a competing hearing on Syria, but we've been fortunate to be joined by Mr. Steve Shabbatz of Ohio, who used to chair this committee and is responsible for that great legislation that we talked about today. And I want to turn it over to you. And Steve, if you want to go an opening statement and go right into questions, I'll defer to you because I know you got another hearing to go to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will be brief for a couple of reasons. One thing, we have a briefing on Syria that I think we're all anxious to get to. I also have a committee meeting going on as we speak in Judiciary, and I wanted to come to this one because this one is particularly close to my heart. Taiwan, one of our strongest allies. As one of the founding members of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, I think it's the goal of many of us on both sides of the aisle to strengthen an already strong relationship between Taiwan and the United States. And I think the Taiwan Travel Act, which many of us fought for a long time, and I want to thank my colleague on the other side of the aisle, Brad Sherman, and also our full chairman, Ed Royce, and many other members, again, on both sides for their hard work on this, and the people of Taiwan and working with us for such a long time to attain this. It'll make a difference. I think the ability of the top officials here in the United States and the top officials in Taiwan, the president, the vice president, the defense minister, the foreign minister, to actually be able to meet face to face, either in Taiwan or here in the United States. I think it's hard to overestimate the value of that. That being said, I think it should only be considered a step, a very important step, but a step towards improving even more the relationship, the alliance between Taiwan and the United States. It's a country, and I don't say that word by accident, it's a country that is a strong ally of the United States. It's in our best interest to make sure that Taiwan remains free. The people of Taiwan, they ought to be and are, I think, in many ways, a role model for other nations who face hostile entities very close to home. And the future of the people of Taiwan, the future of the nation itself should be, and I think will be, I know will be, determined by the people of Taiwan, not by bullies in the PRC, not by the United States. It's not our intention to tell Taiwan what it ought to do. But we know, because Taiwan has been for decades now an inspiration in that it's a democratic nation, one that freely elects its own leaders, sometimes somewhat tumultuous. There's no question about that. Relatively new democracies also experience that. Even ones that have been around for a couple centuries have our own challenges now and then. All you got to do is watch the news to see that that's true. But in all seriousness, I having been here 22 years now, I'm so glad that this was one of the issues that I have devoted a fair amount of time on, because it's been worth it to see Taiwan continue to grow, continue to be a democracy that other nations can look to see how it's done. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of work that still needs to move forward. And I think a lot of us on both sides of the aisle, I want to emphasize that, both Republicans and Democrats working together, will be there with Taiwan, both now and into the future. And I think rather than go into questions, Mr. Chairman, I think I will yield back at this point to make sure that we can get to those other important engagements that many of us have. So I'll yield back.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your work and you showing up on your busy schedule. But I think the Taiwan Travel Act is a historic piece of legislation that sets a tone for a new era in our relationship with Taiwan and around the world. Mr. Stokes, you were talking about a fundamental policy review that should be addressed. And, you know, you've heard it twice here, a country. Taiwan is a country. And when I was over there, we were talking about that. You know, what do you call an entity that has a flag in their own military, if not a country and a democracy? And I know that's taboo to say that, or to take a phone call from President Tsai thanking or congratulating our president. If we can't say those things in the open, I think we're in a very dangerous situation in the world. And I think it is time to revisit this. If we look at, Taiwan was recognized as such a country from 1949 to 71, and 71 to 72, there was this cloud of vagueness. What are we? We're going to recognize you as such, but we're not going to call you that. We're going to recognize you as part of this other entity over here, China, and we are where we're at today. And as I shared with you earlier in Robert Gates's book, Duty, back in the mid-2000s, probably 2012, 2013, we'd had the arms sales going back and forth with China or with Taiwan for all those years since 1979, I believe it was, and nobody complained overtly. But as China was getting stronger, they raised a lot of angst and didn't like our arms sales to Taiwan. And our negotiators said, well, what's your problem? We've been doing this for a long time. And the Chinese admiral says, yes, I know, but back then we were weak. We are strong now. And I think that's a very clear message of the intention, and especially if we move forward. And the Chinese Communist Party and Mr. Xi have an insatiable thirst for power and domination. And as we know, history has shown from time and time again, this is to be a very dangerous situation when people have that hunger for domination and that for power. And what I see is China is threatened by the success of Taiwan's democracy. They're insecure and they're frightened that their communist ideologies cannot compete with freedom. And that's what we have that they so much don't like, because it threatens their form of government. What I have come to see is people and businesses do businesses with those that they know, like, and trust. And if China doesn't honor its word in agreements, as in the transfer of Hong Kong in 1996 from Great Britain to China, where China agreed not to interfere in the governing of the Hong Kong for 50 years, yet it has. Or China ignoring the Court of Arbitration in The Hague, stating that they stated that China has no claim on the EC. And then finally, Xi Jinping blatantly lied to President Obama, stating that they would never weaponize the reclaimed islands, the Spratly and Parsley Islands, in the EC, yet they have. So then my question that comes up, and other people I've talked to, then why would anyone do business in the business world with a company, or in this situation, with a country that lies, that don't like, or they don't like a country? They either lie or their government doesn't honor their word or the word of international law. And I think that's where we're at today. And so the stage is set. As we've talked about earlier in the opening statement, we've had a stable system since World War II that have allowed democracies to flow, that have allowed people to have freedom of expression. And the expansion of that, I think a great example of that is Taiwan, of what they've been able to accomplish, a tiny island nation that's been able to accomplish that, and the very many different contributions they've come up with. And the beauty of being the chairman of a committee, sometimes it's lonely, but I get to ask all my questions. Question number one, and you guys weigh into this as you want to, is Taiwan's democratic success story all the more important as Xi and the CCP seek to export China's governance model to the developing world? What's your thoughts on that? We'll start with you, Mr. Stokes.
Thank you very much for that question, sir. I would posit it in this way. If one views our one China policy in a zero-sum framework, in the sense of we can only have normal relations with one side of the Taiwan Strait or the other. Since 1979, we have extended legitimacy to the Chinese Communist Party and withheld legitimacy from a government that has transitioned from an authoritarian style of rule toward a vibrant democracy. So today's challenge is that we, in a sense, we extend legitimacy to an autocratic government and withhold legitimacy from democracy. And I would ask, I mean, what kind of signal does that send to the rest of the world? Right. It should not be a surprise that the Freedom House has come out with statistics that talks about the decline of democracy around the world. So this is, some would call extension of legitimacy to Taiwan, some would call that for example, symbols of sovereignty. There are guidelines. After 1979, there have been guidelines that have been directed from the White House level that have outlined how we define what's official and what's unofficial. And even use of the term government with regard to Taiwan, as far as I know, or at least it used to be, forbidden. You can't even use the word government. Yeah. You can't use the word Republic of China. You cannot use the word ROC. There are issues like this that sort of purposely withhold legitimacy. And I would argue that one should distinguish between legitimacy and sovereignty. I think, as Julian mentioned, I think the issue of sovereignty we've traditionally not, we've taken an agnostic position at best on the ultimate status of Taiwan, but sovereignty is not necessarily legitimacy, and in my view that should be distinguished.
No, I think that's true, and that's why I asked you about, maybe it is time to revisit these fundamental policies and draw some new definitions for the 21st century that we haven't, that we've been intimidated maybe, or our State Department taking down the Taiwan flag on the logos. I don't still understand why that was done. I have my theories on that, but I think it's something that needs to be put back there. Let's see. Going on, we know that Taiwan was removed from the WHA, the World Health Assembly, and they can't participate in WHO or Interpol or some of the other international events. How and why is China able to subvert a technical organization like the WHO for its own political goals? What's your thoughts on that, Mr. Ku?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to talk about that. Yeah, which I addressed in my written testimony. I think I was struck by what's amazing is that the decisions to invite or not invite Taiwan are not a vote of all the membership of those organizations. So it's not as if they survey all the countries and they vote on whether to accept Taiwan or not. What's interesting about extending an invitation to an observer status to World Health Assembly, it's actually a decision, as I understand it, of the Director General of the organization. So it's kind of a bureaucratic decision. And so there's no open vote where people have to take sides on whether to extend the observer status. And it is remarkable to me that the U.S. cannot exercise more leverage in such organizations, given that we contribute 3 to 4 times or 5 times more financially to each of these organizations. And it's not a political fight where we have to go out and gather votes from other countries. It's just about trying to influence the bureaucracy at the World Health Organization or Interpol or such. And I do, without criticizing too much the State Department, I am struck by the ineffectual efforts of our diplomats compared to China's diplomats.
I agree with that. And as you pointed out, we contribute 3 times more than China. We put in $59 million versus 19, but yet it seems like the WHO bowed to them, and they should be apolitical, and they should look at the contributions that a country makes. You look back at what Taiwan did with the SARS epidemic. They're the ones that discovered the virus that was causing that and did the preliminary work on that saved countless numbers of lives. And so how do we put pressure on the WHO? Do we just say, we're not going to participate anymore, we're not going to fund you, and get them to come to the table and just, I don't understand how they were able to be swayed by China other than by a heavy hand, coercion, or intimidation.
Just to follow up on that, I agree. I think the operative word here is coercion. So the strategy for China is, by denying even observer status, then what they're trying to do is make it harder for people on Taiwan to gain access to the technical benefits of joining these organizations. So it's not about one China or not, it's just about making it harder on the lives of people in Taiwan. And I think that's something that shows China's ill intent in those organizations. I think, frankly, to be honest, this is my guess of what's going on. China cares a lot. China's diplomats have one goal in the WHO, to keep out Taiwan. U.S. diplomats have 50 goals at the WTO. Taiwan's 50th on the list. And so I think what really needs to happen is we need to raise that priority somehow for the U.S. executive branch. And that's where I think Congress can make a difference in trying to raise Taiwan so that the U.S. government puts a little bit more effort in protecting Taiwan in these organizations.
Thank you. Ms. Ma, do you have anything you want to weigh in on any of those?
Sure. I'll weigh in on the first question about Taiwan's democracy. I think preserving and supporting Taiwan's democracy is even more important now in the context of the backslide in democracy and civil rights and human rights in the region. We contrast Taiwan's very vibrant democracy with China's authoritarian system. Taiwan is a partner that reinforces the regional order. President Tsai has reaffirmed that Taiwan stands willing and ready to defend the common goal of freedom and openness and go all out in the protection of the fundamental international order. And this stands in clear contrast to Beijing's tendency towards revisionism, as this administration is increasingly recognizing. It's difficult to really envision how China's future for Taiwan and in the Taiwan Strait would serve U.S. interests. And therefore, I think it's even more critical that we think about how we want to integrate Taiwan into the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. In the third joint communique in 1982, President Reagan said that the United States has no intention of infringing on China's sovereignty and territorial integrity or interfering in China's internal affairs or pursuing a policy of two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. And so that was back in 1982. Yet we've moved to where we are today, and we see an aggressive China. And if you look at, I think it was in your statement, Mr. Ku, where you were talking about the TRA, declares that it is the U.S. policy to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive nature or character and maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort or to force or coercion. What's your thoughts on that from 1982 with President Reagan and the TRA that we have today?
Yeah, I mean, the TRA responded, I think, and tries to deal with, the Six Assurances responded to the 1980 Joint Communique, but I think it reflects some of the instability in our U.S. policy toward Taiwan. I think in pursuing better relations with China, I think Taiwan always sort of is an obstacle to that. So when we want better relations with China, we give up more on Taiwan. I think the TRA, I think, is a reminder that we have a governmental commitment to allow the people of Taiwan to have a free choice as to what they want to do with their future. And what they've chosen so far is to move toward a democratic future, and that's something that the U.S., I think, strongly supports across all parties. And so that should, I think our policy can continue along the same lines. If the people of Taiwan have the freedom to choose what they want, then the people in China have to make a choice as to how they're going to convince the people in Taiwan that if they want to reunify, that they offer a deal that the people in Taiwan can accept. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, China's not offering any deal, and it's hard to imagine that deal happening anytime in the future. In 1982, we could have imagined that deal. Times have changed, and so we need to make sure Taiwanese people can still make a choice.
I think that's very well put, and like I said in that book, we were weak then, we are strong now. So Mr. Stokes, moving forward, if we don't get a good definition and clarification of the status of China, Taiwan, the rest of the world, in 3 to 5 years, what do you foresee if you could predict in the future of if we don't get some clarification of where we're going, the status of Taiwan in the future?
Well, I would go back to answer your question, sir. I'd go back to the original statement of objective reality. Is that Taiwan, under its current Republic of China Constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state. That, in my view, is the starting point for everything.
Well, let me interrupt you right there.
Yes, sir.
Nobody's recognizing that today, other than maybe Taiwan and the United States. I think we've capitulated a lot, especially over the last 8 to 10 years of not really holding people's feet to the fire and allowing Taiwan to be marginalized, with China going to Panama and getting rid of their diplomatic status, and as they've done with some of those countries off of Africa. And then our own State Department blatantly removing the Taiwan flag symbol. I think that was, I've got my theories of why that happened, but if we don't do it now and start recognizing that, is it going to be easier or harder 3 to 5 years from now?
So it'll be harder.
Absolutely.
If we go about if we adopt a satisficing approach to regarding Taiwan, it just you're right on the recognition issue, but Beijing has its One China principle. That's with a capital P, and gradually there is a concerted effort to try to shape perceptions here in the United States and around the world regarding perceptions of and manipulate their definition of a One China principle, and that is, and they are implementing their one country, two systems formula for unification internationally in a concerted way. That is, there's one China, Taiwan is part of China, and the PRC is the sole representative of China in the international community. This is not correct. Our one China policy can be anything that we say it is.
Right. No, I agree with that. Mr. Ku, or anybody that wants to weigh in this, when we've surveyed, people of Taiwan and we've read those surveys, what percent would you say view themselves as Taiwanese versus Chinese? And what percent believe in unification or going back to China versus staying an independent nation as their constitution says? And
I'll start first on. I don't have the numbers at hand. I know the strong majorities are now majorities of people do see themselves as Taiwanese rather than Chinese, although it's not overwhelming. Where it is overwhelming, as I understand it, is among people under the age of 30, which is obviously the future. And I had the experience of teaching law students in Taiwan just last year among the elite law schools, and the future elite lawyers in Taiwan are all pretty strongly Taiwanese and not Chinese in their sense of self-identity. At least my impression was. And more tourists from China has only made that identity stronger rather than weaker. So I think if the people of Taiwan had a free choice, I think we could probably guess where they're heading.
Ms. Ma?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To add to Mr. Ku's point, the polls on sentiments on political unification identification is overwhelmingly demonstrating that most Taiwanese, especially the younger generation, identify themselves as only Taiwanese or both Taiwanese and Chinese, but there's a very small minority only that identifies as Chinese. Another interesting poll I'd like to raise is done by the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, which asks the participants whether they would fight in a war against China. And when asked if the conditions of war was due to Chinese pressures and coercion and attack against Taiwan, this response overwhelmingly jumps up to affirmative that yes, they will stand and fight for Taiwan. So given this, as Mark says, objective reality of where the situation is really that the Taiwanese population, the sentiment is that they would not like to unify with China, this calls into question the sustainability of the U.S. policy position, where under the Six Assurances especially, the U.S. emphasizes process, so the U.S. would not play a mediation role. It would not push Taiwan to negotiate with China, and as Julian mentioned, the U.S. takes a position of neutrality, and that is increasingly difficult to sustain when the objective reality is that if people of Taiwan were free to choose, they would choose not to unify with the mainland China. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Mr. Connolly from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Ma, picking up on that last point, but isn't it true that in polling, overwhelming majority of people on Taiwan want to continue the status quo indefinitely? They neither support reunification nor outright independence. Is that not correct?
Yes, Congressman Connolly, that is correct. There is overwhelmingly preference for the status quo.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's because in part of Taiwan's really remarkable democratic transition. I think the people of Taiwan enjoy the lifestyle that's afforded by the political freedoms that they enjoy. The vibrant economy, democracy has given rise to an economy, a system of government that features strong rule of law. So I think these personal freedoms are very important to the people on Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Of course, presumably another part of that is concern at not unduly provoking the neighbor, right? Because if we want to preserve our way of life, our democracy, our quality of life, an island of 25, 30 million people with 1.5 billion people staring them across the strait, you don't needlessly provoke them. And my sense is the common sense of the Taiwan people tells them that. irrespective of what politicians in Washington or even Taipei may want to do. You talked about reinforcing U.S. Taiwan relationship, and you talked about maintaining a constant and coherent position on Taiwan. I'm looking at the Trump administration, the call with President Tsai, reconsideration of the one China policy before reaffirming that policy. Now we have a new third national security advisor talking about playing the Taiwan card as if Taiwan were some kind of game. Do you think we have maintained in this new Trump administration, a constant and coherent position on Taiwan?
My view on that is that the Trump administration is still formulating its broader policy towards the Asia-Pacific. I do think, however, it is important to maintain a consistent and coherent position of Taiwan, and I think Congress plays an important role as a bulwark against the fluctuating priorities that might happen in the view of the executive branch when it comes to pursuing particular policy agenda vis-a-vis China. With respect to maintaining a consistent position, I think part of maintaining a consistent position is very much how Congress can help respond to Chinese retaliation. And in that vein, things like the Taiwan Travel Act, the additional language in the NDAs play an extremely important role in response to that.
Thank you. Mr. Ku, did you want to comment on that? You need to turn your button on, that's all. Thank you.
So I guess just on the broader question of the status quo, I think China has this law called the Anti-Secession Law, which allegedly requires it to use force if there's any action taken towards separatism in Taiwan, and that law was reaffirmed by President Xi in recent statements. I think the message from China is pretty clear to the people of Taiwan that an open move toward independence would be met with military force, at least a threat of that. And I think reasonable people would say, well, why do that? why start a fight? Status quo is pretty good for us. I think the interesting question for people, though, here and for members of Congress and the leadership in Washington is think about how long can this situation continue in this sort of status quo standoff? And I think it's hard to predict the future, but it's something that it does worry me a lot, that we can't maintain that sort of tension much longer as we see the trends in Taiwan, the young people moving away, at least in self-identification, from China. And yet, on the flip side, I think the Chinese government has become even more bellicose in its rhetoric, not less so. And that's not a good sort of situation, I think, in terms of trying to maintain the status quo.
And if I could follow up on that, there have been recent articles about the brain drain from Taiwan, and lots of young people seeking their fortunes in the mainland. There was, they profiled one young woman as a designer, and she wanted to go to the glitter and lights of Shanghai. I'm old enough to remember nobody would talk about glitter and lights in Shanghai, but now, so how much of a threat is that long term? That maybe the mainland's playing the game of we'll just squeeze the lifeblood out of them instead of a military option, and talent and brain creativity will be drained out of the island, and we'll win that way.
So just on that one point, I have a lot of confidence that that won't happen, because I do believe Taiwan will remain a really different place and offer a lot more in the long run to people like that than China will, despite the obviously economic benefits. I think over the long, people talk about the brain drain from Taiwan to the United States. People talk about, I think Taiwan has been able to sustain itself, and I think a lot of those people come back in the long run.
I don't know if the chairman wants to allow Mr. Stokes to also comment. I thank the chair.
So if I can offer some brief responses. First, on the status quo, that's a term used both on Taiwan and here in the U.S. without a lot of definition put to it. I would argue that on Taiwan, I think there's a rough consensus that the status quo, again, going back to the mantra I mentioned before, is that Taiwan, some people can use different formulations. Some people just prefer to use Taiwan, exists independent sovereign state. Some would say that Taiwan, known formally by ROC, and then the one that I mentioned. But when my perception when that term status quo is used, it's Taiwan already exists as a country. When the term Taiwan independence, in my view, generally is going to mean taking steps to revise the Constitution, taking steps to revoke the law governing relations between the Taiwan area and the main area, things like this. And there certainly is a substantial part of the population who believes that Taiwan should be a normal country. Here in the U.S., we've never, you'll see the mantra, there should be no unilateral change in the status quo as we define it, but we don't define it. In my view, the status quo in the Taiwan Strait is the existence of two legitimate governments. I take Representative Rohrbacher's comment that the Chinese Communist Party does not represent a legitimate government.
I thought he was actually talking about Russia.
Maybe, but I'll leave it at that, sir.
Just a final point, and thank you, Mr. Sherman. But obviously, it's a balance, and I take all three of your points of view. But I mean, unnecessarily provoking the mainland, Beijing, is not in anyone's interest. On the other hand, simply abrogating our own responsibilities and our own control of the bilateral relationship with Taiwan is not in our interest or Taiwan's, and I would argue long-term, not in China's, the mainland's either. So it's a balance, but we can't simply cede the control and the rules of the game in the relationship to Beijing. And I, as I said in my opening remarks, I certainly hope Beijing does not misunderstand that, because that miscalculation could be very costly to them as well as us. I thank the chair.
Thank you for your comments. We'll next go to the ranking member, Mr. Brad Sherman, California.
I'd like to say, having visited Taiwan, not as often as the gentleman from Virginia, that there is so much vibrancy there, so much lifeblood, that even if 100 talented people a year go to the mainland, even if thousands come to the United States every year, there's not a shortage of vibrancy, intelligence, capacity, and entrepreneurship. That's why I welcome some of the most entrepreneurial Taiwanese to my state, knowing that there's plenty left back in Taiwan. The status quo is acceptable. It's worked. The status quo plus this or that change works better. And there will come a time when Beijing either tires of trying to cross the straits or finds itself in tough straits and focused on something else. And that could be a time when Taiwan crosses the line to independence. The Taiwan wants the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. This clearly seems like a defensive weapon in the sense that, Mr. Rohrbacher's comments aside, none of us imagine the government of the Republic of China taking aggressive action and landing its forces on the mainland. So it would be a plane that would be used to defend Taiwan from invasion, fully consistent with our legal stance. Should we sell the F-35 to Taiwan? I'll go through Mr. Stokes.
Sorry, I'd like to start off by a comment that whether or not a system is defensive or offensive depends upon what side of the gun that you're standing on.
No, there are.
Yes, sir.
All of us can imagine the mainland invading Taiwan. That's a nightmare. With the exception of one gentleman who's no longer on this dais, none of us imagine Taiwan landing its troops on the mainland. The days of Chiang Kai-shek's return died with Chiang Kai-shek and long before. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Exactly. Taiwan's strategy is inherently defensive. As you mentioned, they gave up this notion of recovering the mainland many years ago.
So should we sell the F-35?
If Taiwan requests the F-35 based upon a consensus within Taipei, I think we should.
Mr. Ku?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have expertise on weapon technology, but I do think that the overall policy, if it's defensive, and it's consistent with our own interests in terms of how we hand out the technology, we should.
And Ms. Ma?
I think Taiwan is in the best place of determining its defense interest. I think we should consider focusing on what is going to be the most cost efficient, the most flexible, the most agile, the most resilient for the Taiwanese defense budget.
Okay.
And
Taiwan deals with major American allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, that are in its region. To what extent are those countries yielding to pressure from Beijing, and to what extent are those countries maintaining a good relationship with Taiwan? Ms. Ma?
Thank you. I'd like to point out in particular the relationship between Taiwan and Japan, which has undergone some symbolic upgrade in terms of elevating the names of the representative office. And I think that's a relationship with significant potential, as Japan very clearly faces similar concerns with Taiwan vis-a-vis China. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And does Japan do business with Taiwan in a robust way?
I think they do, and I think they will. I think there's significant potential for that. Japan is, of course, a critical U.S. ally in the region and a host to a very significant U.S. military presence. So I think Japan's role in a Taiwan contingency alone should drive the Japan-Taiwan relationship forward.
We've got a $9 billion trade deficit with Taiwan. Now, that's just a small percentage of the total trade. It's not a lopsided relationship like we have with Beijing, and of course it's smaller. Taiwan's smaller than China. But what can we do to increase American exports to Taiwan? Does anyone have a guess, an answer? You can't just say sell the F-35s.
Taiwan is taking measures to address the trade deficit. So, for example, it's starting to purchase U.S. LNG. But looking at the largest categories of U.S.-Taiwan trade, which is in machinery and also agriculture, I would identify those two as major areas for deepening cooperation. And then I also want to point to Taiwan's sort of innovation moves. You know, it's trying to become Asia's Silicon Valley. I think there's a lot of prospects in cooperation on AI and in the ICT sector as well that could help address the trade balance.
I'm told that there are soybeans ready to export across the Pacific that may not be purchased in another country on that side of the Pacific that may be available. It'd be asking too much to ask the people of Taiwan to eat as much as the people of China in total, but every bit helps. Finally, there's the issue of whether this Congress should invite the president of Taiwan to come and address us. Normally, you only invite in conjunction with the State Department. We departed from that with the Netanyahu invitation. That didn't work out in the sense that it didn't achieve its legislative purpose vis-a-vis the congressional vote on the Iran deal, but I don't think the president of Taiwan would come with a particular bill that they were trying to deal with. Should Congress just say, what the heck, and invite the president of Taiwan to address us? And could you imagine the administration denying a visa to someone who is coming here at the request of the United States Congress, or the House of Representatives particularly? Mr. Stokes.
So I would, in terms of responding to the question of whether or not Congress should invite President Tsai, I would argue that after consultation, if the two sides think that would be a good thing to do.
Are the two sides, because we get along fine with Taiwan, it's the executive branch that over the last 22 years I have not been as supportive.
Just no, there's not a unilateral announcement that we're going to invite President Tsai over. I would say I think that warrants positive consideration to be able to for Congress to invite the President of the Republic of China, President Tsai, to Congress to be able to address Congress after consultation between Congress and her.
Between Congress and Taipei, and maybe we'll leave the White House out of it. Mr. Ku.
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult decision because I think it would spark tremendous firestorm in China. So I think that's why it is important to consult.
Yeah, I think one could take a much smaller action and invite the foreign minister to brief this committee. which would be which would be a step in that direction, and would have the additional advantage that we would not only gain from these three witnesses, but from the foreign minister. Ms. Ma.
I agree with the caution that Mr. Stokes and Mr. Ku offered. I will say that if through consultation it was determined that this was the best course of action, I think it would be a tremendous step forward in the U.S. Taiwan relationship. I think President Tsai is probably best positioned to articulate Taiwan's needs and predicament. And, you know, she's somebody who knows the United States very well. She spent time here at Cornell. She visited Washington, D.C. frequently as the opposition leader, and I think she will come to Washington, D.C. And be welcomed by many friends.
Maybe we start with the Taiwanese, quote, ambassador, unquote, to Washington, then move up to the foreign minister and put the head of the head of state visit off for a little while. I yield back.
No, that's fine, and I appreciate you coming back. And I got to give a plug. President Tsai also taught at the University of Florida Law School for 6 weeks. So go Gators. You guys bring up some very interesting and challenging topics. What do we do? And I think the most important is, what does Taiwan want to do? I think you've heard it said here that we'd like to be facilitators. We have an agreement. Mr. Ku, as you've pointed out, the different things that we have in like Section 4 declares that the U.S. policy will consider any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means, including boycotts or embargoes or force, a threat to the peace and security of the Western Pacific, and or grave concerns to the United States. And that sentiment is reiterated over and over again in that agreement. Mr. Connolly, I want to challenge a little bit, even though he's not here, was talking about maintaining the status quo. And the majority of the Taiwanese people preferred the status quo. However, the status quo has changed. We don't live in a static world. It's dynamic. There's flux. It's always changing, and it's changing more than it has probably in the last 25 years. I was at a meeting with a bunch of the generals, and they're saying we're going through a tectonic shift in world powers we haven't seen since World War II. And so how does this change the calculus, since the status quo is changing? How does this change the calculus of maintaining the status quo? You want to weigh in on that? Mr. Ku, go first. You had your hand up first.
Sorry. Thank you. I think this is a very important question. I think one way to think about this is a thought experiment. If this were any other country in the world that was not located 100 miles from China, and they had a free and fair vote on their future, we would, in the United States, laud their decision-making in many cases and be likely to support it. I think the difficulty here is all geopolitical rather than our values. Our values, I think, lead us naturally to support the type of free and fair democracy that Taiwan has and the freedom of the people there to choose. The question for the United States is strategic. Does that fit with the strategic interests of the United States? And that's a difficult decision.
Mr. Stokes?
I would come at it from a slightly different angle, sir. And that's that, again, going back, if the status quo in the Taiwan Strait is the existence of two legitimate governments. And one could argue that another way to approach it is that the United States policy should move toward a more accurate representation of that status quo.
Ms. Ma, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I think echoing what Mark said, you know, I think it goes back to the question about how sustainable is our emphasis on process. Can we remain agnostic as to what's going on, but rather advocate that future determination status quo is left to the people involved on the ground? So I think that's the question that U.S. policymakers have to determine going forward. Thank you.
Okay. And I wrote here, for 22 years, 1949 to 1979, Taiwan was viewed as a sovereign nation, pretty much world round. From 72 to 2018, that's 36 years, we've had the status quo. Taiwan didn't change other than being a successful democracy, moving from an authoritarian to an economic powerhouse. The United States didn't change. You know, we worked on trade, economics, so who changed? What we've seen is a rising China that feels threatened, and I go back to the statement I made about the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi Jinping, or whatever he is now, have an insatiable thirst for power and domination. History again has shown us time and time again, when you have this combination, it's dangerous for the rest of the world. Again, China, I feel, is threatened by Taiwan's democracy. You don't hear of a brain drain coming out of China. You hear it coming from other countries into China, because where people are free and they have liberties, they develop their innate abilities for freedom and liberties, and they develop those things that other countries want. And the United States, I'm thankful to be born here in a country that allows us to express our opinions, our freedoms, or anything we want to, but it also gives us the creativity quotient that is missing in parts of the world where there is suppression, like a North Korea or a China. And if you look at some of the great developments in the last 500 years, how many have come out of a country that has been run by an authoritarian state? Not many, because they don't know how to dream. They don't know how to think about that. And so my caution would be that we move slowly with the Taiwanese people to find out a solution that provides them with the security that they deserve, that they've earned, and that they can continue a vibrant democracy and an economic powerhouse that's contributed so much to the world, whether it's medicine, biotech, electronics, or other. And I think China should take this as maybe a wake-up call, not as a threat. We don't want to threaten anybody, but as a wake-up call of how we can solve this problem without the detriment of Taiwan or relationships in the Asia-Pacific theater. And how can we get along and build on the success of that country that they benefit from also, and that the rest of the world benefits from too, because nobody's trying to take over China or Taiwan from the rest of the world. And I would think that we could work this out to where it's a win-win situation, where people save face, and that we develop a new status quo that allows an independent nation to continue to do what they do, and work with the people of Taiwan to find out what their new status quo wants to be, that we can facilitate with other regional partners. And I'll give you guys, Mr. Sherman, do you have any last comments?
I went long enough last time. Thank you very much.
Do you guys have any last comments? We'll just go down the line.
Sir, I would offer that in terms of your statement before, Mr. Chairman, the most fundamental change that we've seen, at least since 1972 or perhaps since 1979, is not necessarily with the Chinese Communist Party. In a fundamental sense, it remains somewhat similar to what it was before, with some changes on the edges. The most fundamental change that we've seen has been the transformation of Taiwan, or the Republic of China, into a democratic country. Well, it's always been a country, but into a democracy. The most fundamental change has been the establishment and consolidation of popular sovereignty. This change is fundamental. Our current policies that were developed, whether it's 1972, 1979, or 82, were in a different era, and our policies yet to catch up with this fundamental change on Taiwan.
Mr. Ku.
Just building on that, I think it would be, because of Taiwan's democratization, it would be a strategic catastrophe, not just a values problem, but a catastrophe for United States foreign policy if an aggressive authoritarian communist regime conquered a liberal democratic government. That would be a strategic catastrophe, putting apart the affront to U.S. values. So that actually does change the calculus, and probably does cause us, and probably should cause us, to rethink that. And I would reiterate that Congress can play a huge role in shaping that rethinking and getting that rethinking process going in the United States.
No, I think that's a very valid point, because if they do that to Taiwan, who's next? Who are they going to look at next and say, we're going to change this country? You know, we don't have claim to them, but they didn't have claim to the South China Sea or the EC, but they claimed it. And so that's what I worry about. Ms. Ma.
Thank you. And building on that last point, I want to reiterate that developments in the Taiwan Strait are very closely watched by U.S. allies and friends in other parts of the world. So in my view, anything that's short of demonstrating U.S. resolve in the face of Chinese coercion and sharp power and that includes failing to uphold U.S. commitments to Taiwan or trying to play the Taiwan card. Doing so would set very dangerous precedents that undermine long-term U.S. interests in the region. But on the other hand, if we reinforce the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, I think that can very positively reinforce U.S. long-term interests in the Indo-Pacific.
I think that's well said, and I think it's timely. If not now, when? As we talked about, it's not going to get easier 5 years from now. And so I want to tell you how much I appreciate your input. It was successful because members kept coming in and out, and you didn't have to listen to me the whole time. So this subcommittee hearing on Asia Pacific has adjourned.